Hi, today I'd like to talk to you about the minority attack. The minority attack is a strategy that you'll play usually in the queen's pawn structures, where you essentially attack a larger group of pawns with a smaller one. The idea is that with your minority, or your smaller number of pawns, you'll weaken one of the majority and isolate it and eventually round it up and win it. Then later on, with your extra pawn on the other side of the board, that should be enough to win. Let's have a look. I probably should have set the board up without pieces, so we'll just take them off for now. Okay, we'll start off with a position from a queen's gambit where these are swapped. Now, for white, we have 3 pawns on this side of the board. Black have 4. Black has 4. So 4 pawns here, and 1, 2, 3 here. So your majority's over this side. You could also argue that it's 2 versus 3. Now, the main idea of the minority attack, we try to weaken something. So b4 and a4, and we'll eventually push b5. So the idea of this move is that if black ignores this, now of course there are pieces on the board at the same time. Don't think this is just something for a pawn endgame. If black ignores this, we swap like this, and this pawn here at c6 is quite weak, so we'll start piling up on it with queens and rooks like this, or we may dump a knight in the outpost, for example. Now we can even use tactical themes, for example, takes here if there's a rook. Obviously you can't take because of the pin, although I'd rather not sort of use tactical themes on a strategical lecture. Essentially though, the main point, you swap here and start ganging up on this pawn like this, and sometimes you can even make a switch and then attack it from the edge as well. Of course black doesn't have to just ignore it. Black might decide to swap. Now in this situation, you've still got your pawn minority here. Then this pawn's potentially weak, so your pieces kind of make a switch over to this side and attack this one. Now, in the meantime, if black dissolves that one and gets an isolated pawn, we do exactly the same thing. Now note black also has an isolated pawn here, which we can also gang up on. So for example, this sort of thing. Gang up on that isolated pawn, gang up on that one. At some point, black's not going to be able to defend all of these pawns at once. Let's just go back to our minority attack position without the pieces. So this is roughly what black will be trying to do here. Now, of course, what happens if black has pieces on the board too, obviously. What happens if black decides to push past? In that case, we swap and then we have an isolated pawn. So once again our heavy pieces make the switch and start attacking the isolated pawn. We control the square in front with a knight, and at some point swap everything off and try to win the pawn endgame. This is a common minority attack in the Queen's Gambit, and it comes right from the opening even. You know, you'll start this plan probably at about move 10, maybe move 15. Very, very common situation. However, it's not the only time you can play a minority attack. It's not all about the Queen's Gambit. I'll show you another position where we can often get this, and that's in the Maroczy bind in the Sicilian or in the English, depending how you're looking at it. So Maroczy bind pawn structure is usually you've swapped these pawns off, and white's got a big sort of heavy bind of pawns here. Now, when the pieces are on the board, this structure for white is very, very strong. White will have knights here dominating, 2 bishops like this, rooks and queens, in a very dominant type of position. It's very hard for black. Black's getting squeezed for space. Black's often a little bit restricted in these sorts of positions. They'll play a6 and sort of try a minority attack, but it sort of gets hard. But gradually, as pieces start leaving the board, the minority attack starts working a little bit better. So we'll just take all these pieces off again. Okay, so the basic minority attack here for black is to play b5. Now, of course, this move is not playable because we just take. If white captures, then our minority attack works on the a file. Pile up and try to gang up on this pawn. So if you can get that move in at some stage, the pawn is terminally weak. You'll at some point just win it. If they decide to push it, well then you've got the situation, yes it's a passed pawn, but it's also an isolated pawn. Sometimes you often get people debating whether this is a good thing in that it's a passed pawn or a bad thing in that it's an isolated pawn. I tend to feel when it's a passed isolated pawn that's come out of a minority attack, tends more to be a bad pawn, and the reason is because you've usually got heavy pieces piled up against it before it even becomes a passed pawn. So in that case it tends more often than not to be a bad one. Of course there'll be someone out there watching this who's won a game with a beautiful passed pawn like this, but I think it's more the exception rather than the rule. Back to the exact scenario. So that's if they take here, then we go after the a pawn. If they do nothing, then we simply swap. And now we've isolated the c pawn. So pile up your rooks and queens on the c pawn. A very, very strong square for an outpost too, this one. And you'll gradually start working your way into this position. You might attack it laterally from the edge. Of course, you just traditionally attack it down the middle. Quite an easy position to play. Weaken everything, you'll eventually pick off some pawns and your extra pawn should be enough to win. So the minority attack, I can't recommend it more. It's a very, very useful strategy. One more thing I will say about it. It's a strategy that's been around since day dot. Your Capablancas and Laskas and Alakines and players from, I suppose, the olden days used to play this strategy, and it's still used nowadays by your modern strong grandmasters. I think Kramnik's played some very nice games with this strategy, and of course Kasparov would have, and Karpov, etc. I can't recommend it highly enough, and it's just a generally good strategy to know. Yeah, enjoy. Thank you.